Ian and Sally Lawrence, high achievers. Ian had learned to fly and Sally had worked her way up from PA to MD.
Ian Lawrence was a pilot and so was I, and I actually introduced them to each other. She was basically looking for a partner and I said, well, I know somebody who I thought at the time would be ideal.
John Bolting, a father figure in Sally's life, thought them a perfect match. But a car crash would claim the life of Sally Lawrence, leave her husband apparently injured but being treated in hospital. Detectives arrive at his bedside.
It was quite clear at that time that his injuries weren't as severe as first portrayed to me. I then made a decision that Mr. Lawrence would be arrested on suspicion of murder.
Had an airline pilot forgotten that cars can tell investigators much about how they've been driven?
Data recorders are contained within many modern vehicles, so you end up with Windows snapshots of the crash.
What would a vehicle's digital record tell detectives searching for the truth in the case of Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence? When Ian Lawrence and Sally Perks met, it seemed that two soulmates had come across each other.
Ian Lawrence was seemingly a very successful man. He had been an airline pilot. He was a successful businessman.
Sally had worked her way up from being PA to the managing director at the Chemical Spills Company, and she was doing particularly well.
Very, very bubbly. Incredible enthusiasm for life, always smiling, you know, and always looked on the bright side of everything. It didn't matter what it was, she was always on the plus side, you know. Nothing was ever half empty with Sally, you know, and yeah, I thought the world of her.
John Bolting wanted her to be happy, and he thought he knew the right man for her.
She was basically looking for a partner, and I said, well, you know, I know somebody who I thought at the time would be ideal.
When Sally was introduced to Ian, they got on really well and quite soon were married in a very lavish, extravagant wedding.
I do remember her asking me if I would go to church and give her away, and I said yes, absolutely I would, providing she asked her father first, because they'd fallen out. And I'm very happy to say that she did ask her dad, and he did say yes, and he did come and give her away, and it was quite a do. They got married in St James the Greater Church in Leicester, and there were somewhere around about between 200 and 250 people. It's a big church, a lot of people in there.
They've splashed out on the reception, and it's really sort of lavish celebration, and everything looks absolutely fine. Two people very much in love, big wedding, good job, good future.
They let off 15,000 quid for the fireworks. I mean, the display went on for about 40 minutes, something like that. It was quite extraordinary. I've never seen anything like it.
So Sally and Ian began married life with a bang, and for a few years the marriage sparkled. They lived in a home which Sally had bought. The couple had a baby.
They are parents who are older than perhaps many. He's 40, she's in her late 30s. But they dote on this child, and children can sometimes have a good or a bad effect on relationships. It seems in this case it was a good effect because it bound them together more, and they both loved being parents.
Sally's career was going from strength to strength. Her boss and mentor handed over the reins of the business to her, and she began running the company.
She absolutely agreed. She took to the job like a duck to water. I couldn't believe it, how good she was.
But for Ian Lawrence, things weren't going quite so well.
In 2007, that seems to be the beginning where things started to go wrong for Ian Lawrence, and he was sacked from his job as an airline pilot, and that seemed to set in motion a kind of a downward spiral.
It's from this point that the relationship really started to go downhill and to turn sour.
She told me she used to confide an awful lot in me, and it was apparent to me that things were were going really, really wrong.
Ian became moody, short-tempered, jealous perhaps of Sally's continued success.
The first cracks began to appear in this perfect-looking life and marriage when Ian lost his job as a pilot. And him losing his job coincided with Sally being on a period of very swift advancement in hers.
She told me things that were not right. I knew that they were not, sharing a room together. I knew that she was spending a lot of time away with her family in Derbyshire.
So you've kind of got this reversal. You've got Ian being in the position of being the breadwinner, being the person with the glamorous job. He loses that, and at the same time, Sally is on her way up to a position of power.
Quite often in some relationships that look almost perfect from the outside, things are very, very different behind the scenes. And where you have this almost, sometimes you might think it's like a managed vision of what the family is, that usually means that there's somebody in the background who's very controlling. And I think probably that Ian Lawrence was a very controlling individual.
There is clear evidence that was the case.
We were in a local pub. We'd gone to have a business lunch, and she was telling me that she was really frightened of him, and that, she was frightened of what he would do.
As time went on, I think those cracks got really big, and although that they were living together still, they were living separately, so the marriage was falling apart right in front of his eyes.
As the marriage began to fail, so Ian tried to reinvent himself as an entrepreneur. He started a number of small businesses. He would again appear to be a great success. Sally would be impressed.
He then set up some businesses, and latterly he was running a trailer business locally in Leicester.
He genuinely thought that the marriage was worth saving, and he wanted to save it.
And he also had a share in a go-kart racing business, which was based at Leicester Airport.
This is very much a man who wants to be in control. This was a man who insisted that his wife fall back in love with him again, which clearly wasn't going to happen.
All of his business ventures failed. Friends suggested to Ian that he was trying too hard. He was noticeably changed from the high-flying, successful pilot with a confident way.
It's pretty clear to see that this was a turn for the worse for their relationship.
One of the things that controlling people really do not deal with very well at all is when they are challenged, and usually their home life, their family, their children, their financial status is the way they perceive themselves in the world. And when that starts to crack, they can get quite panic-stricken.
As time went by, Sally could no longer face living with Ian. The relationship had broken down. She wanted to move on with her life.
And it becomes apparent that the relationship had broken down between Ian and Sally.
In 2012, Sally actually filed for divorce, and it was that divorce that seems to have unsettled things at that point.
Sally had commenced another relationship with another man.
She wanted a new relationship, and that would have been incendiary for somebody like Ian Lawrence. At least at this point, there was the facade that they were still together, that he was still in control, and in a lot of ways he did still have a lot of control over her because they were still living together. But she was going to leave, and that would have escalated things dramatically.
She was looking to move on and just start a new life away from Ian.
Things between Ian and Sally get so bad that she asks him to leave the house, and he refuses, stays there, but they are, to all intents and purposes, living separately under the same roof.
They'd been living separate lives for over a year, although living in the same house, and they were sharing custody of their 10-year-old son. The relationship was stressful.
For Sally, what had begun as the perfect marriage had turned into a prison. She felt she couldn't escape. Ian was refusing to leave her home and refusing to accept that the marriage was over.
I said at the time to Sally, I said, don't worry, all bullies are cowards. I said, the chances are he won't do anything. But I couldn't have been more wrong.
Living under the same roof but leading separate lives, tensions were high in the Lawrence household, and Sally was desperate to move on. Witnessing her one-time high-achieving husband reduced to a frightening wreck.
She would have seen firsthand the escalation in his anxiety, in his anger and his resentment, and she would have been very well aware that perhaps he was becoming quite threatening, and it was probably quite an intimidating atmosphere in that house during this time.
Months after Sally had told Ian of a new relationship, Ian Lawrence was still refusing to accept that the marriage was over and was unrealistically hoping to convince Sally to stay with him.
Ian has the aim to try to patch things up, try and make the marriage, the relationship and the family work. But Sally doesn't think that's the way to go. She doesn't think that that can be done.
She was looking to move on and just start a new life away from Ian.
Telling Ian once and for all that there was no future in the marriage was to be the trigger behind what appeared to be a car accident on a road in Leicestershire, England, in October 2012.
Ian, in the background, was refusing, absolutely refusing to let go. His whole identity was tied up in this family, his whole status in the world, and there was no way in his head that he was going to let her, as he saw it, do this to him.
No one but he knew that Ian had set a date for murder.
Divorce proceedings were ongoing. We found out that the decree nisi was due to be served on Monday the 8th of October.
While Sally planned her life without him, Ian Lawrence was planning how to get what he felt he deserved, which in his case meant the proceeds from the sale of the Shad house, a house he had not paid for.
The house was at the time valued at probably £300,000. There was a lot of equity in it. That was all in Sally's name.
He had nothing, and they'd agreed terms, and then a couple of days before, well, one day before, he changed the terms and said he wanted half of the house. She said no, he wasn't getting it.
Sally had texted close friends and her daughters, just raising some concerns around Ian's demeanour. He was demanding more money out of the house. She was saying in some of her text messages that she felt threatened. She didn't want to be alone in the house with him. One of them said she'd locked herself in her bedroom.
She feared that he would actually kill her one day.
This is one of the really big red flags that we see when this kind of thing happens, that the victim actually foretells what could possibly happen to them.
Ian was fixating on a date, October 8th, 2012. The day of the decree nisi, the day he would get his hands on a family home and an insurance payout. But only if Sally was dead.
Sally also had a life insurance, and that would have given Ian $250,000. So when we're looking at potential motives for murder, there aren't that many, but two of the main ones are jealousy and greed, and they're both motives that Ian would have had.
And I think he felt he was running out of time and he needed to put his plan into action.
He wouldn't have wanted Sally to be with anybody else. And then the financial side that he would gain through Sally dying before the decree nisi, then that was substantial to him as well.
It's a surprising fact that, for more often than not, in these cases, where somebody absolutely refuses to let go and their behaviour starts to escalate, that they may make the decision that they're going to kill the person who they see as causing all the angst in their life.
Once Ian Lawrence had decided upon his plan, Sally's fate was sealed. There was no going back then. It was going to happen.
And Lawrence's weapon of choice would be a car. As a pilot, he felt he had the skills to manoeuvre an engine the way that he wished.
Ian Lawrence made the decision that he was going to kill Sally, and he started to plan for that, and it seems that what he decided he was going to do was make her death look like an accident so that he could protect himself.
He devised a plan to actually crash the car into the tree on the road near where they lived.
Ian was a practical man, and he was an intelligent man, and he put a lot of thought into his plan.
The car crash he was planning would happen on the Gartree Road in Oadby, Leicestershire.
He decided upon the road where he was going to do it, picked out the tree that he was going to hit, done some dummy runs or reconnaissance runs to see what it was like there, work out the time of day when it was best to do it.
The murder spot picked, he then needed to manipulate things to ensure that Sally would be in his car. The weekend before the divorce would be finalised. Their child was on a school trip.
And this would mean that Ian and Sally would be left in the house without him. And that's something Sally felt she couldn't face and didn't want to happen. So she made arrangements to go and stay, indeed with a boyfriend.
She had her overnight bag packed. She had a handbag with a purse and a phone, all ready to go on the back seat of her car. And that would have been around between 5 and 6 p.m. on that Saturday evening.
Sally was ready to drive away, in her car.
The other difficulty that he had was getting Sally actually to get into the car, because it was so old and so grubby, she never went in it. She wouldn't go in it. She refused to go in it most times. So he had to come up with a plan that was going to put her in the passenger seat of that car so that he could do what he wanted to do.
But she didn't get into her car and drive away, and some of her friends thought that that was very unusual. She actually got into his car, so he must have somehow, and we don't know how, got her to get into his car.
Sally's car was very clean and tidy, pristine inside, very well kept. Ian's car was more like a workshop. It was full of junk, full of rubbish. Sally was always well dressed, and her daughters would say that she would have never got in that car voluntarily.
I don't know how he ever got her into that car. It's an old banger, and I just bought her a new Jaguar. So I don't know what happened there. I never will know, I don't suppose.
He may have frightened her into getting the car. He may have told some plausible story.
Whether she was coerced, whether she was forced, we do not know. Only Ian Lawrence knows the answer to that question.
But she did get into the car, and that was the last time anyone saw her alive.
But what we do know is that she left her home address in the passenger seat of that Peugeot and was then driven along towards the racecourse and then along Stoughton Road towards the airport.
He had adapted the car to suit his needs for the crash he had planned.
So at the time, Ian Lawrence had a maroon red Peugeot 406 Estate. I think at the time it would have been about 10 years old. Had a private number plate on it which spelt Windy, which alluded to his flying days. I think some of his friends called him that as his nickname. It was a big solid estate car.
He had her in the position that he wanted, with him in control in an area he knew intimately.
He had a go-kart track just up the road we used to go from home to every day. So that's the route that he took with Sally in the car.
As he drove towards where he knew he was going to crash the car, he suddenly leaned over and he unclicked Sally's seatbelt.
He had to wait until it was too late for Sally to realise what was happening, but he had to get that seatbelt off of her before they hit the tree, or else it could have saved her.
And he then put himself into the brace position and drove straight into a tree at 50 miles an hour.
In a collision of a magnitude of 50 miles an hour, there's a huge amount of energy that's dispersed in a collision. If you remove all of the restraint systems in a vehicle that are designed to protect you, the likelihood of injury goes up incredibly, and therefore your likelihood of suffering fatal injuries are increased greatly.
This was a high-impact collision with a motor vehicle and a very large tree. The car had impacted almost square on, but mainly on the passenger side, and the whole of the front of the car had crumpled up. So it was a significant impact.
If you're not wearing a seatbelt, when the vehicle stops moving, your inertia causes you to travel forwards. In the case where a seatbelt isn't being worn and there's a sudden deceleration of the vehicle, the occupant moves forward and you can often see them striking the windscreen, and you end up with damage to the inside of the windscreen, pushing it outwards.
And that was how Sally was found. She died on the scene, probably aware in her last few seconds what was happening.
It would have been quite a scary moment, particularly in the last few seconds at a speed of 50 miles an hour, closing in on a tree, would have been quite scary.
The airline pilot had used his skills to fatal effect, and not without risk to himself.
The simple act of driving a car deliberately into a tree at 50 miles an hour without braking is something I think many people would find very difficult to do.
It's a high-risk strategy. Driving a car into a tree with the hope that it's going to go so perfectly well that you're going to survive and the other person isn't. But it still shows a very reckless nature. He was willing for it to go wrong. He felt so strongly he was probably willing to die if that's what happened. But the important thing was that she did.
I found out the next day, the next morning. It was absolutely horrendous. I was with my best friend and I just went into shock, I think.
I think it was about past midnight, so going into the 7th of October, when I received a call from one of my detective inspectors. The passenger in the vehicle that had collided with a tree had died at the scene, and the driver of the vehicle, who was a male, had been taken to hospital and appeared to be unconscious and had, on the face of it, some trauma and some potential brain injuries.
Ian Lawrence stood to own the family home outright and to benefit from a £250,000 insurance payout. He had survived the car crash and was going to be rushed to hospital whilst Sally lay dead in the passenger seat. Had he committed the perfect murder?
Ian Lawrence's story after the accident was a kind of a low-risk strategy, really, because he pretended that he couldn't remember anything. And if you can't remember anything, you can't be picked up on lies.
Through meticulous planning, Ian Lawrence had murdered his wife. To investigators, his own injuries seemed oddly superficial.
In this case, there was a huge disparity in the injuries suffered by both of the occupants in the vehicle. The driver suffering relatively low-level injuries for an impact of this type, and the front seat passenger sustaining fatal injuries.
The police and the paramedics arrived at the scene, and I think there were suspicions straight away, especially with the paramedics.
There were some comments around whether or not he was feigning some of his injuries and feigning unconsciousness.
Ian Lawrence was pretending that he was unconscious, but he wasn't acting that out awfully well, and the paramedics would be very used to seeing people who really are unconscious, and they told of their suspicions to the police.
The fire brigade had attended and had had to cut the occupants out of the vehicle because the doors wouldn't open. That was the severity of the impact.
The first two people to arrive on the scene, one was a retired police officer and the other one was a retired fireman, and they knew straight away that something was wrong. He was feigning being unconscious, and they knew that something was completely wrong.
The condition that I was being told of the driver was that he was in and out of consciousness, was displaying signs of trauma, but nothing visibly physically. So he had no cuts, no apparent broken bones.
Despite Ian's odd behaviour and the reservations of paramedics on the scene, he was admitted into hospital. He had been in an accident and seemed to be showing signs of a severe head injury.
He was displaying symptoms equivalent to a 7 on the Glasgow Coma Scale. So the Glasgow Coma Scale is used to ascertain somebody's consciousness and alertness when they've been involved in some kind of trauma, usually head trauma. And they rate from 15, being fully conscious, fully mobile, down to 3, which means you'd be lying there in a coma and probably going to die. So to be scored as a 7 by medical experts at that time would put Mr. Lawrence with some severe head injuries that on the face of it weren't apparent. There didn't appear to be any bruising, any swelling or any lacerations that would cause him to have a Glasgow Coma Scale of 7.
At the hospital, Ian Lawrence continued to appear to feign injury. By this time, the nurses caring for him had become suspicious.
Later on, a nurse contacted us in the incident room saying she wasn't comfortable with a patient that she treated that evening and believed that he may have been feigning some of his injuries.
Elsewhere, another aspect of Ian's story was unravelling.
So when the police started their investigation, they were able to find out a lot of information, and I don't think people realise quite how sophisticated these crash scene analysis are, especially with the computerisation of cars and the knowledge we have about things like tyre marks.
From looking at the scene, they weren't satisfied that this was a pure accident. They noticed that the roads were dry. The bend on which the accident happened was not a severe bend. In fact, it would have been drivable to upwards of 70 miles an hour, and that would be to remain on your same side of the carriageway.
It became clear to investigators that there was no clear cause for the crash, and further anomalies were appearing all of the time. Mark Crouch is a crash scene investigator who examines cases just like this one.
When a tyre slows, it will lock. Those kind of marks can be seen on a road surface, but there weren't any found on this occasion. When a vehicle leaves the road, particularly on mud, grass, verge, you can get quite a distinctive mark where the tyre drags the grass, drags the mud along, and you would expect that to happen even with quite a low level of braking. What was found on the verge in this case was a rolling tyre mark. That wheel didn't lock out.
The car had gone into the tree and had not slowed down, and they were also able to show that there were lots of other places that the car could have come to a stop.
There were escape routes either side of the tree. There was a farm gate entrance that would have offered little resistance if you'd have wanted to drive through that. If your brakes had failed, you'd have gone into a field and gradually just coasted to a stop. So then we looked at the actual tyre tracks and the road that led to the point of impact, and there was no apparent skid marks on the tarmac.
Further evidence emerged as detectives dug deeper.
The seatbelt clasp, the retainer of the driver, was protruding upwards, and that is a sign that that has been in an impact, and there was abrasions on the seatbelt itself consistent with it being in place at point of impact. The passenger side, the clasp, retaining clasp, was sitting down in the normal position, indicating that the seatbelt had not been engaged on the passenger at the time of impact. Her family members were adamant that she was very, very safety conscious. She would never get in a car without putting on her seatbelt. It was second nature to her, and nobody had ever seen her in a vehicle without her seatbelt on.
For Ian Lawrence, apparently slowly regaining consciousness in a hospital bed, a new challenge. What story could he tell the police to explain the mounting evidence against him?
It was about 4 o'clock in the morning when I had a conversation with the collision investigator, and as a result of everything that he'd relayed to me, I then made a decision that Mr. Lawrence would be arrested on suspicion of murder while he was in hospital. It was quite clear at that time that his injuries weren't as severe as first portrayed to me, and he could really at any time discharge himself and walked out of hospital. So to prevent that, and in line with what I knew, he was arrested on suspicion of murder.
He said he got no memory of it, he was unconscious.
Memory loss was a convenient claim at the time, but it didn't match the fact that medical practitioners could find no head injuries. It wasn't going to convince the police.
He was then released from hospital later that morning and then taken to a nearby police station. He was assessed for suitability for detention, booked into the police station, and then he underwent a series of interviews. In his first interviews, Mr. Lawrence claimed that he had a total loss of memory. He didn't remember anything after 5 o'clock, and he regained his memory. He remembers being in hospital at about 9 o'clock that night. So there's a 4-hour gap there where he couldn't remember what had happened.
He underestimates all of the other people around him, and that's probably because he's got a very high opinion of himself, and it doesn't occur to him that anybody would see anything other than an accident because he said so.
Ian Lawrence was a prime suspect in the murder of Sally Perks, who became Sally Lawrence, but detectives have to prove their case beyond doubt, and Ian was sticking to his story.
So Ian maintained throughout his police interview his amnesia and therefore his innocence. He denied that there was anything wrong with the relationship. He denied that he'd intentionally crashed his car. He denied that he'd unclipped Sally's seatbelt prior to the point of impact.
Facing a resolute Ian Lawrence, investigators needed a breakthrough. It would come in the shape of a little-known fact about cars. They have the motoring equivalent of the black box found in aeroplanes and are designed, amongst other things, to record the details of an engine's performance.
We found out that within the vehicle there was an electronic control unit that controlled the deployment of the airbags.
Vehicles are fitted with supplementary restraint systems, SRS for short. They control everything, the airbags, the seatbelt. But in order to control those, it needs to decrypt some of the signals that are going around the car. But the vehicle needs to make a decision when it's going to deploy an airbag. That's an electronic control module, often shorted to an ACM, and it decides when the crash is happening and decides when to deploy the airbag. Lots of those ACMs record the events of a crash, so you end up with window snapshots of the information that black box had at the time that the crash occurred.
The so-called black box revealed the lengths that Ian went to ensure Sally's death.
So that was recovered from the wreck of the vehicle, and we took that to Peugeot, and a technician there was able to read the data from that. And from the data held within that box, we ascertained that the passenger airbag had been switched off, and had been switched off some 6 cycles prior to the crash. That was groundbreaking for us. We could actually prove that somebody had turned that airbag off intentionally, and that's why it didn't deploy.
In this collision, we have a number of different factors striking the tree on the passenger side. The seatbelt not being worn, the airbag being deactivated, the lack of clear braking marks as the vehicle left the verge. Individually, those pieces aren't that significant, but when you start looking at all of those together, it starts to build quite a compelling picture that something unconventional happened in this collision.
In order to disable the airbag, it takes a physical act. You have to have the key to the vehicle, insert it into a socket, press down into the spring and turn it physically. So it couldn't have been done accidentally. It was an intentional act to turn that airbag off.
So detectives had the method, but at that stage they felt they didn't have the motive. Ian was maintaining that the couple were in a close relationship.
To him, they lived together. They've been living together for over 10 years. They had a 10-year-old son. They had a normal family life, and he didn't allude to any problems with the relationship at all. So as part of our ongoing investigation throughout that next day, we're in contact with Sally's family members through her sister, her daughters, and it becomes apparent that the relationship had broken down between Ian and Sally. They'd been living separate lives for over a year. Although living in the same house, the relationship was stressful, And we then later found out that, in fact, Sally had commenced another relationship with another man and had been in that relationship for about 10 months.
This, coupled with the black box evidence, was enough for Detective Neil Castle to make his move.
That, on the face of it, was fresh evidence for us. It was something that we weren't aware of before while Ian Lawrence had been in custody. I then made a policy decision that was fresh evidence, sent officers out to further arrest Lawrence. He was brought back into custody, a short interview, and then we presented those facts to the CPS, and they gave us authorised to charge murder.
Ian Lawrence was arrested for murder, but he was maintaining his innocence, and police had to convince a jury that these were not just coincidences, or Ian Lawrence might still walk free, and he was already planning what he might say to get away with murder.
He said he had a dream while he was in prison, and it came back to him in a dream.
Saying that he had a medical condition and he could prove that his leg spasm.
Ian Lawrence had been charged with the murder of his wife. Investigators were painstakingly piecing together events before the car crash that Lawrence was still claiming had been an accident. It emerged that central to what happened that October evening was Sally's planned trip.
Sally was planning to go away for the weekend on that Saturday evening. She had her overnight bag packed, and that would have been around between 5 and 6 p.m. on that Saturday evening.
Why then had she got into the car with Ian?
Clearly she would not have left her handbag there and keys and money to get into his car, this filthy car that she'd never get into unless she'd been forced.
Part of the defence evidence that the jury had to consider was that Lawrence had crashed because of a leg spasm.
Ian Lawrence eventually came up with a version of events that while he was driving along that road, he had a seizure in his leg, which then pressed down on the accelerator, increased speed of the vehicle. He was unable to move his leg and engage the brake, but he did manage to get his foot off the accelerator, but the vehicle glided and continued towards the tree. He didn't give any explanation as to why the passenger side took the full force of the impact.
The prosecution evidence was put to the jury. They were told that Sally, known for her safety consciousness, had not been wearing a seatbelt at the time of the crash. Ian appeared to be prepared for the crash by adopting a brace position. That could be concluded from a mark left on his chest by the watch that he was wearing.
It was a large face watch, and visibly it looked a similar size to the bruise on his chest. And the only way that that could have got there is that if Ian Lawrence had adopted a brace position by folding his left arm, right arm under his seatbelt, and then on impact the seatbelt would have tensioned and squeezed his arm and hence his watch tightly into his chest, causing that bruise. He knew that he was going to strike that tree, and yet he had peace of mind to adopt that brace position. He also must have raised his legs up because there was no impact and no injury to either of his legs, and yet the car was concertinaed quite badly.
The car's controls had been altered to prevent an airbag deploying, a job Lawrence would have found straightforward.
Turning passenger airbags off is quite an easy thing to do. It's a function that's built into many vehicles, because if you wanted to fit a child seat to the front of the car, for example, it's unsafe to have an airbag that would go off in those scenarios. Most of them activated on a key, so you can just turn it off on the side of the vehicle to stop the airbag activating in a crash of that type.
At the scene of the crash, he had pretended to be unconscious, none too convincingly to the paramedics who arrived.
Even at a crime scene, those suspicions of the paramedic are probably the thing that sparked the investigation. So Ian Lawrence made another mistake there. He tried to fake being unconscious, and he clearly didn't know how to do that.
And as investigators probed the timelines of the lives of Ian and Sally, it became clear that they were far from happy. and that Ian stood to gain financially from Sally's death. To do so, however, might not be possible after their divorce was final. The former airline pilot had a deadline to meet.
He decided that he was going to try to murder Sally and try and do that in a way which, as far as he could see, would be the perfect murder.
And if he succeeded, there was much to gain.
I know why he did it. He did it for money. He was a failed businessman. He got 3 small companies, all of which were struggling. He murdered her on a Saturday. The decree nisi was due 2 days later on the Monday. And Sally had been very successful. She had a great job. She was well paid. She had a lovely big house at that time. Was worth, I don't know, £350,000, something like that. And he had nothing.
Despite his careful planning and continued claims of innocence, the jury unanimously found him guilty of the murder of his wife.
I had no misgivings whatsoever. I knew what the verdict was going to be. Everybody cheered at the time. I didn't.
Ian Lawrence made one last desperate bid to escape justice. He appealed, offering evidence of an excuse that he had raised in court during his trial. He claimed to have multiple sclerosis, which had caused a spasm in his leg so that he had unwillingly pushed down hard on the car's accelerator.
I mean, it was just so pathetic, you know.
There was nothing wrong with the steering wheel, even if what Ian Lawrence had said about having a leg spasm were true. He could still have steered the car away from the tree. But what they found in the appeal was that his leg spasm would not have caused the accident as it happened.
He got life with a minimum of 24 years. The judge put 3 years extra on for it being for money. He put another 3 years on for him using the car as a weapon to kill her, and then he put another 3 years on because it was premeditated.
The couple had met and appeared the perfect match on a lavish wedding day. They had begun their own family before Ian's world disintegrated around him, leaving him bitter, angry. Eventually he had killed his wife, but justice had been done.
So everything we do as police officers is for the families of the victims. And it's a great feeling when you can look the family in the eye and you know that you and your team have done everything you can to secure and preserve the evidence, to then put a case together, present it at court and convince a jury that that person was guilty of that offence. And that's what we did.
Ian Lawrence will not be eligible for parole until 2037. Sally was 47 when she died and was described in court as inspirational, caring and kind.
Yeah.